In this video, we're going to have a look at the interpretation of graphs. We've now had an in-depth look at 4 different graphs. When it comes to the interpretation of these graphs, you need to make sure that you know the theory very well. You need to know which graphs have axes of symmetry, which have asymptotes and where to find those, and so I can continue naming things. It's also important that you know how to determine the length or distance between 2 points on functions. If, for example, we want to determine the distance from A to B, you will see that this is a vertical line. When you need to determine the length of a vertical line segment, you need to calculate the difference between the 2 y values. This gives you that length. So in this case, the distance will be the difference between 4 and -2, which is a distance of 6 units. Similarly, when you want to determine the length of a horizontal line segment, you are going to make use of the 2 x values. So to calculate the distance from C to D, I'm going to take 4 minus -3, which will give me a distance of 7 units. Let's have a look at some examples. In the sketch, we have F, the parabola, and G, the straight line. A, B, C, and D are the intercepts with the axis, and D is also where the 2 graphs intersect. First question, determine the following lengths, and we need to start off calculating the length from A to B. This is a vertical length, so we need the y values at A and at B, and these are the 2 y-intercepts of the functions. So we can say that the coordinate at A is 0, -2, because that's the y-intercept of the straight line, and at B, it will be 0 and -4. The difference of the y values of A and B will be 2, and that means the length from A to B is 2 units. Next, we need to determine the horizontal length from C to D, which will be the 2 x-intercepts of the parabola. Firstly, we need to now determine those coordinates, and we do that by changing y to 0 in the equation of the parabola. If we now solve x, you will see that C is the point -20 and D the point 20. It's always a good idea to add all the coordinates that you determine on the sketch, because you might just need them again later on. The distance or length from C to D is then the difference between the 2 x values of those coordinates, and the difference between -2 and 2 will give a distance of 4 units. Question 2. Determine the length of EF if it is given that OG is 3 units. Because we are given that the distance from O to G is 3 units, we know that G is at the point 3, 0, and then we also know that both E and F have x values of 3. But we need the 2 y values because we need to determine a vertical distance. To determine any y value on a function, we need to take the equation and substitute the x value. So when substituting 3 into the parabola's equation, I get a y value of 5, and substituting 3 into the straight line will give me a y value of 1. So the length of EF will be the difference between 5 and 1, and that is 4 units. Question 3. For which x values is gx smaller than 0? Here it is important that you remember that the whole gx represents the y values of function g. And here we are asked where these y values are smaller than 0, meaning negative. All the negative y values lie below the x-axis, and that means that we need to determine where graph G lies below the x-axis. For this, we focus on the straight line's x-intercept. To the left of this x-intercept, the whole graph lies below the x-axis and will have negative y values. Therefore, our answer will be all the x values smaller than 2. Question 4. For which x values is f, which is this time our parabola, bigger than 0, which means now we want a positive y value? The y values that are positive will always lie above the x-axis. Again, we're going to focus on x-intercepts, but this time those of the parabola, and we need to see where this graph lies above the x-axis. In this case, there are two parts of the graph lying above the x-axis. The first part will be all the x values to the left of coordinate C. Every single x value to the left of -2 will give me a y value that is positive. Similarly, any x value bigger than 2, so to the right of 2, will also give me a positive y value. So this answer consists of two parts. Firstly, it will be all the x values smaller than -2, and then also all the x values bigger than 2. Question 5. For which x values is fx smaller or equal to gx? Here, for the first time, we are asked to compare the two graphs. We need to determine where f, the parabola's y values, are smaller than that of the straight line. Smaller y values lie below the bigger values, so here we are asked to determine where the parabola is below the straight line. In this case, we're not going to focus on the x-intercepts anymore, but we're going to focus on the points of intersection of the two graphs. We were given the point -1, -3, and we determined point D as 2, 0. These two x values of -1 and 2 divide the graph into 3 sections, and we are going to have a look at each section on its own. Firstly, you need to try and ignore the right-hand side of the graph and only focus on the part to the left of our first x value of -1. Here you can see that f, the parabola, is above the straight line which is below, and this means that f is bigger than g. This is not what we are looking for. Next up, we're going to focus on the interval between the two x values, and here you will see that the parabola lies below the straight line, and that is what we are looking for. The last interval is everything to the right or bigger than 2, and here once again the parabola is above the straight line or bigger than, and that is not what we are looking for. So our final answer will be the interval right in the middle. To write this down, we are going to say that x lies in between the two x values of -1 and 2, with both -1 and 2 included in our answer because the question said that the two graphs can also be equal to each other. In this video, we've now had a look at only a few examples of interpretation questions. The more you practice, the more you'll get used to different types of interpretation questions.